Welcome to The Imposters. This is a podcast about expertise. Who gets to define it? Who gets recognized as an expert? And whose knowledge is overlooked in humanitarian and development spaces? The Imposters recenters aid around affected communities and lived expertise. In each episode, I speak with refugees, migrants, and Global South practitioners whose expertise is shaped by experience, context, and leadership. These conversations explore what expertise and legitimacy look like in the sector, and how imposter syndrome is often a systemic outcome rather than a personal failure. Each guest joins the Imposters, an archive of lived experience experts in global development. We are a growing network of practitioners committed to elevating lived expertise in humanitarian and development work. I am your host, Laila Raouf. Welcome to the Imposters. Over the course of this season, we've heard from practitioners whose lived experience shaped how they understand and navigate systems that weren't built with them in mind. But as we move forward towards the end of the season, the question becomes, what does it actually take to change those systems? In today's episode, I'm joined by Tharwat Abaza, whose work in accountability to affected populations, AAP, sits at the heart of this question. With experience across UN agencies, INGOs, and national organizations, Tharwat focuses on ensuring that humanitarian programs aren't just designed for communities, but with them. Because collecting feedback is one thing, but shifting power is something else entirely. I'm really excited to welcome Tharwat to the Imposters today. Hi, Tharwat. How are you doing?
Hi, Laila. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be featured in the season.
I'm sure you know if you've been following the project, I like to start every episode with the same question, which is, do you ever feel like an imposter in humanitarian spaces?
I mean, my answer would be wholeheartedly yes. I mean, it is a feeling that is, I would say, almost inescapable to a great extent for a lot of people, not just for me, but for me specifically for so many reasons. And one of them being the fact that I am essentially someone who shifted into this career. I did not study in my undergrads to be part of this kind of work that I'm doing now. I studied dentistry and I did my master's in dentistry and I practiced for 6 years almost and only to find myself sort of very slowly and gradually shifting into this field. And I remember the time when I was just an intern and I was called the oldest intern in the organization. With that comes a lot of questions and doubts and self doubts and doubts in my knowledge and even the experience that I'm garnering and trying to harness, my proficiency in this field. I still, even to this day, struggle. And I've been working in this field for the past almost 6 years. And yeah, I feel like while it gets better in certain regards, it still sort of lingers on. And it's something that, yes, I would again call inescapable to a great extent.
I hope people listening to your episode, this makes them feel better about themselves because I kind of think of you as like a local humanitarian celebrity. Like I actually feel like
Oh my God.
it's
Oh,
true.
wow.
Everyone knows who you are. You're like the poster child for like being a good humanitarian, an ethical humanitarian. And if you struggle with imposter syndrome, then I don't know.
I am absolutely humbled by what you just said about me being some sort of celebrity in the field. I mean, I am a people's person. I love connecting and I love talking to people, and I am always happiest when I meet someone and we have a conversation about something that we both understand, and I don't have to explain my soul or explain the kind of work that I'm doing. And I feel like I'm absolutely humbled. And I just want to reiterate, yes, it's absolutely normal to be feeling like an imposter in this field. It is absolutely normal. From everything that I've seen and people that I've talked to, it feels like it's something that you just have that is part of the package. And maybe this is why we strive to do more and learn more, and we strive to do our jobs in a certain way, maybe even like, it allows us to become a little bit critical. And I mean, sometimes it can lead to paralysis, but for the most part, I feel like it is a human. And we're working in a humanitarian field that requires a lot of humans, a lot of people who are humane, who are in touch with that human aspect in them. And if that comes with imposter syndrome, so be it.
Yeah, maybe it's like internal that's how we'd have our own kind of like checks and balances system. We're constantly
Exactly.
auditing ourselves.
Maybe. Yeah.
Can you elaborate a bit more, like, specifically in your transition to humanitarian work, this, like, imposter syndrome, how does it show up for you? Do you have any examples?
Yeah, I mean, I've been listening to all the previous episodes and they were all fascinating
You
and
really
you've
listened to all
interviewed.
of them?
I listened to most of them, not all of them. I maybe missed the past couple of episodes, but every other episode since the beginning I have listened to, and the other ones I'm going to catch up on. But I've been thinking about my own answer, like while I'm listening to other people's answer to this question, I've been thinking about my own, and I feel like there were areas when it was very subtle, and there were areas when I could literally feel the nagging of it or the weight of it. And the areas that are subtle we're looking more into, like maybe I've been met with some jargon that I didn't understand, especially when I was just starting in the field and people were like talking in this language that wasn't familiar to me. And I am there and I know that I'm, like educated. I have a master's degree in hard science. And at the end of the day, I ended up, like leaving this meeting feeling like I know nothing. I absolutely know nothing. And there's a certain heaviness, like when you get out of a meeting like that and it starts, like implanting all these self doubts in your head, like maybe, I remember thinking maybe I should go back to dentistry. Maybe I should just, go back to what's familiar. Maybe I don't like being in a meeting room like this when I understand almost none of what is being said. And I remember, if I showed you my notebooks in the beginning when I started in the field and all the meetings that I've been dragged in and like the notes that I was taking, most of the notes were like questions. Like I would write down an acronym that I just heard and, like say, ask X after the meeting, go to X after the meeting and have them explain to you. And I mean, the more non subtle ways in which I felt the imposter syndrome, I would say when I was working as a frontliner in one of my previous experiences, and that entailed working with unaccompanied and separated children. And I remember being in an interview room with a child, and I'm listening to one of maybe the hardest problems that I've ever been exposed to happening to someone else, let alone a child, and all the protection risks and all of the hardship that this child has gone through. And I remember feeling for a second, like maybe I'm not ready for this. Maybe I don't have it in me. Maybe this is not something that I can withstand for another month or 2 months or a year. And I remember, like going home and feeling absolutely down by the fact that maybe the realization is I'm not good enough for this job. I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can keep doing this. I don't know if I can help this child. I don't know if I'm met with another problem, how will it feel like and how will it overpower me? And maybe I don't have enough power in me to actually help this person, who is hanging on to every single word I say. And I think this was the more profound aspect of experiencing imposter syndrome is you're in the heart of it. It's like you're in the operation room and you have a patient lying in front of you, their chest open, and all of a sudden you feel like you're not confident in being able to carry on with the surgery and save this person's life. And it's just a very heavy feeling.
Thank you for sharing that. Um, we've talked a lot in this season about lived experience being overlooked. So, this project, I'm really concerned and interested in kind of analyzing the lived experience of practitioners in development and humanitarian spaces. So, from your perspective and with this like great background that you have, Do you think humanitarian systems are actually set up to listen to communities and then also practitioners like you?
I mean, where do I start with answering this question? I feel like if I want to put it simply, I would say not yet. I would say the humanitarian system still has a lot to do and a lot of work to do internally in order to become a system that is actually responsive to the affected people and led by the affected people themselves. And I feel like this is why something like AAP exists as an operational framework in organizations right now. It is the beginning of that shift that is necessary in order to truly put affected people at the heart of our work as a humanitarian system. And the reason why it exists and it exists with that name that is super specific, like they could have just called it accountability framework, right? But they chose to call it accountability to affected populations framework, right? Because humanitarian systems are good with other types of accountability, other directions of accountability, like upward accountability or internal and sideways accountability. Upward accountability meaning to donors, to governments, to entities that these organizations have to report to, and internal meaning amongst other organizations and looking internally among staff members. And so, while the humanitarian system has been historically good in these two directions specifically, this one specifically is requiring a lot more thought and a lot more work in order to start actually laying the foundation for the ultimate result, which is making sure that people are actually at the heart of decision making.
That's such a great answer. I do want to back up a little bit because I believe there may be a lot of people who this could be a new term to them, accountability to affected populations. And I don't want it to be confused with like MEL or meal,
Yeah,
monitoring,
exactly.
patient,
Yeah.
accountability, and learning. So they
Yeah.
can be confused with each other because, like you said, organizations are already set up to do this kind of horizontal and vertical evaluation. So, how would you describe accountability to affected populations to a beginner, and where would they find this sitting in an organization?
So, to start, accountability to affected populations is an operational framework that is now being mainstreamed amongst many organizations, big and small. And it might not always be called accountability to affected populations. Sometimes it will sit, under the head of the organization or under the deputy head of the organization. And sometimes it will sit in a specific unit, like, for example, the most famous being planning, monitoring, evaluation, or monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning. And sometimes it will sit under protection component. And sometimes it will sit under operations in risk and compliance. And basically, regardless of where it sits and what it's called, the heart of the operational framework is the same. Accountability to affected populations is an operational framework that we created in order to, first of all, recognize the power differential that we as organizations have against affected populations themselves or people in need of our assistance. And it comes to basically try its best to close that gap in the power differential or balance it out a little bit by doing three main core things. The first pillar is making sure that the affected people are actually informed and there is transparency between our organizations and the affected communities, information regarding who we are, why we're here, why we are doing this work, how we're going to do this work, when will assistance be available, how will it be given or distributed, and so on and so forth. And transparency comes into play here because it is about giving honest answers to the communities, even if there is a certain part that we will not be able to satisfy. It is about saying that exactly that to the communities and maybe giving them the reason why. The second pillar to AAP is participation, and we're looking at active and meaningful participation and not just the sort of tokenistic exercise that maybe most of us have been historically doing. So, active participation and meaningful participation means that we include affected people in the decision making process from the get go. We don't retrofit it in implementation. We don't just say we're going to do a few focus group discussions and that's participation for you, or we're going to do a survey and that's that. No, it's making sure that affected people's opinions, they shape our intervention. We do it conjointly. We discuss with them in the beginning what we plan, and then we get their feedback on our plan, and then we can co-design together. And then they are our partners throughout the entire program cycle, from planning, designing to implementation to monitoring, evaluation, and reporting. So this is the second pillar. And the third pillar is feedback mechanisms. A lot of people always reduce AAP to feedback mechanisms. And that is, for me, one of the biggest problems that sometimes also push it to be more of a monitoring and evaluation thing than it is a programmatic cross-cutting component, right? The fact that it's reduced to feedback mechanisms makes it, just concerned with getting people's opinions on our assistance as we go, and perhaps not even being able to do the entire loop of the feedback mechanism and actually getting back to people with answers to their questions or complaints or suggestions and so on and so forth. And so feedback mechanism is one of the main components of AAP, but it's not the only one and it's not the most important one. So feedback mechanisms basically means that throughout our interventions and our plans, we avail mechanisms that can capture people's opinions, that can capture people's suggestions, that can capture people's questions and respond to them in real time. So it's about creating that space for a two-way conversation and not just relying on these one-way mechanisms like a poster or a flyer or, like an email or a WhatsApp message that is just, going into this one direction and not allowing a response back. So for feedback mechanisms specifically, the availing of a channel is not enough. In order for a channel to become a mechanism, you need to have that entire cycle, which is being able to avail a channel that people will trust and use. And it's based actually on their communication needs and preferences. And then making sure that you're recording that feedback somehow and analyzing the trends out of the feedback that you're getting, and then informing decision making in the organization with senior management, for example, and then reverting back to the communities with what is going to change based on the feedback that you've been gathering.
Hmm.
And sometimes organizations will expand on these pillars and include other aspects to make sure that the entire framework is clear enough. For example, I was working in an organization that expanded accountability to affected populations into 7 pillars. Some of them included localization or building local capacities, ensuring that evidence based decision making is one of the pillars and not just embedded in feedback mechanisms. So, yeah, so this is AAP for you.
Well, it sounds as a framework great. Sounds like it should work, like, sign me up for this. And as you said, a lot of organizations have these structures or are beginning to implement these kind of structures to collect feedback and co-design. Based on your experience, does that feedback actually influence decisions?
I would say yes and no. I would say yes and no because whatever I'm going to tell you is not a universal fact across all organizations. Now, obviously, there are organizations that are much closer to the communities, and therefore, by default, they are applying all pillars of AAP without even fitting into that big organizational framework that we are creating. And they, I would say, are doing it naturally, like you can actually see how feedback is affecting decision making and is actually affecting a change in the way we do things. But the bigger the organization gets and the bigger the influencing factors and incentives affect whether feedback can actually lead into change in decision making or not. And an example for that is a lot of big organizations, they are donor driven. And donor driven meaning that the donor that is giving us the funding has their own goals and objectives, you know what I mean? And then it is basically creating that relationship where the organization is taking that money in order to use it underneath that overall goal or objective. And while a lot of donors are actually big on AAP and they do ask for accountability measures and accountability systems in place, when things come to the decision making table and now you're saying that there has been a lot of feedback that we're getting on a specific intervention, that is requiring us, for example, to remove that intervention or do it in a completely different way, then it will be, it will be governed by whether we're able to use that money in order to change in that direction or not, whether the donor will actually approve that direction or not, and whether there is actually motivation internally in the organization to change the way we do things and we've been comfortable with for a very long time or not, because there's also the element of the staff themselves that have been doing this job for maybe 20 years, 10 years, 15 years, to actually do something in a way that they're not very used to, but is actually more, is actually more fitting for the community. So the influencing factors, they vary, and this is why I say yes and no, because you can see it happen in certain examples that are maybe quote unquote easier to do and will not affect us all that much or affect the way we do things all that much, and you can see the struggle when it's actually something that is maybe on the bigger scale that would require a bigger change.
And those organizations that do it more organically, would those be like local community-based organizations or maybe refugee-led organizations? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I was thinking about refugee-led organizations that I have the chance to actually work with and to meet the staff of. Yeah, I mean, they are the best at doing this without even, like having a framework that is super fancy, that is filled with jargon, that is complicated. No, they're doing it very naturally. It comes to them very organically because it is, from the people to the people. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so, who knows the needs and preferences of these people best? It is the people who are closest to them. It is the organizations who are embedded in these communities geographically, even culturally, linguistically.
Mm.
And so they
Yeah.
have a much shorter distance that allows them to do this, first of all, efficiently, second of all, naturally, and third of all, quickly.
Yeah, it's a good argument or example for localization, which you said
Yeah,
sometimes is
exactly.
already is one of the pillars as well.
Yeah.
So, okay, so those are some of the ways that it doesn't execute. So what would you say needs to happen internally for that community feedback to actually change a program?
One of the best, I've been obviously researching AAP as I was doing the work a lot. And one part of the research was looking at how other organizations are doing it, other than the organization I was working with at the time, which is a big organization, but is looking at other organizations, and it's also looking at the same organization, but in different countries. And what are the examples there? And one of the best definitions or ways of explaining AAP that I came across was it's a cultural shift. It's an internal cultural shift in the organization that is steering away from accountability being just something that we have with donors and host governments to something that we have towards the affected communities we're trying to help. And so, what it began with, even before explaining the pillars, it began with explaining that it's a cultural shift. And when I say cultural shift here, I mean organizational cultural shift. It requires a shift inside the organization that, aside from having an AAP operational framework or a strategy that is written and put in some drawer somewhere, it is more about having these people internalize accountability to affected populations. And by internalizing it, meaning that they believe the value of it and how it complements the kind of work that we want to do. Sometimes we all have our intentions in the right places. We all have our, ultimate goal is to help people. This is why we're working in this field. But sometimes we run the risk of thinking that we know more than what the affected people need or what the affected people know, and therefore we come in with our own ideas of what they need, only to be met with a lot of either resistance or lack of interest, or like taking the assistance but like not using it, not have it be something that is actually useful for them, that helps them build their resilience or build their capacities. But what if I told you that if you internalize AAP in that sense, if you understand what it is asking you to do, which is not additional labor to what you're already doing. And if you do it, you make sure that your interventions are actually being used, that they are actually successful, that they are actually causing that impact that you want to see. right? Because they are relevant. And what if I told you from an operational perspective that this is how you become much more efficient in the way you use your resources as well? Because if you spend less time worrying, like going in with your intervention only to realize that it's not the appropriate intervention for the community, and therefore you have to go back and ask the donor to change some of the interventions, and all of this is time and money wasted.
Yeah.
That could have been easily saved if we did have that co-design mentality from the get-go with the communities. If we did have, at least access to the communities to have some sort of consultation before we start, before we finalize our plan, and before we invest all this money into our plan. You know what I mean? And this will save us a lot of time and a lot of money, and eventually also make sure that our interventions are effective and efficient.
Mhm. I totally agree with you that it requires, like, a culture shift of where your staff needs to, like, internalize this. They need to, like, live and breathe these values. But I think, like, for organizations, for some reason, that's a really hard thing for them to execute, and I contemplate this, like, a lot. Like, where does it begin? Does it begin at the recruitment stage? Does it begin in, like, the frameworks that we try to execute? Like, what do you think? What do they need to put in place to make that culture shift real?
I think you need to look at who is the holder of resources in general first. And I think this is something that needs to constantly be on the table with donors that we are getting money from. This is something that needs to always be embedded in our conversations, in our proposals, in our concept notes. It is something that we need to be advocating for with the main holders of resources, right? And this sort of sets the tone for the rest of the work, because it is not about just getting a staff member and training them as part of their onboarding. This alone is not efficient. And we know that, a lot of people, they would go through the mandatory trainings and just like click, 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 pass, 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 and then they're done. And they think, halas, like I did my part, I am onboarded. It is much deeper than it. It's much deeper than that, right? It is something that requires being to a great extent mandatory, not optional. It is something that requires to be well resourced so that you don't have that excuse to say we don't have the money for it or the time for it. So in order for that to happen, and it needs to start at the very beginning. It needs to start at the very table, and then once you make sure that it is resourced, you can then see how you want to implement it across the board, mainstream it across the board. And so, yeah, I mean, it starts at the very beginning. It starts at the part where you are still in the process of mobilizing resources and gathering funds in order to start doing the work.
Yeah, it's like you said at the beginning, it's like people that you don't have to explain your soul to. So you should just have a soul check with people at the negotiation table. If I don't have to explain my soul to you, then you're right for this type of work. Also, when I asked this question, I thought maybe you would give some, like, fluffy, like, peace and love answer, but no, you gave a very straightforward, step-by-step technical answer about how to operationalize this, so there's no more excuses.
I can tell you, like from my perspective as someone who worked on it in an organization where we were still kickstarting it, and I happened to be the dedicated staff for kickstarting and mainstreaming AAP in our organization. When I was working on an office strategy, I was looking at two things. I was looking at the internal part, at the internal system that we have, at the way we write our proposals and make sure that AAP is embedded, at the way we resource and budget for it, at the way we embed monitoring indicators that are strong enough to actually give enough weight to accountability, at the way we train our staff on AAP and train them more than once and have refreshers. And this is exactly what I tried to do to make it non-optional. I was part of a team that reviews all project documents and proposals for the organization. Any team inside the organization is working on a proposal, and even if they didn't manage to come by me in the beginning, I will catch them at the review phase because I'm part of the team that does the review. I get an automatic notification that a proposal is being submitted or a project document is being made. And this is where I can come in and actually talk to the project team and make sure that AAP is reflected in a way, right? The external part was looking at also how we work with our implementing partners or partners in general, at how we are also advocating for AAP even beyond our organization. Because AAP is not just our organization's responsibility.
Right.
So it's something that required the entire village to also believe in, right? And then the operational side, which is also looking externally, like how we do the implementation of some AAP activities on the ground. How do we share information with affected people? What is the best way to do that? How do we design our messages and make sure that the information we're giving out is actually matching the information needs of the affected people through the channels they prefer? How are we designing these messages to actually be accessible to these affected communities? And then, looking at how many consultation sessions or participatory assessments we're going to do as part of this project. And then what kind of feedback mechanisms are we deploying as part of this project for this specific community? There you go.
There you go, easy. No big deal.
There you go. Very easy.
Well, let's talk about accountability versus performance. So, I don't wanna assume, but I'm sure maybe you've seen this before. What happens when communities do speak up and they follow the framework and they do their part and nothing changes? What's the impact of that?
Well, the obvious impact of that is the huge lack of trust in any further interaction with this organization that we're talking about. And loss of trust doesn't necessarily mean that people will not come and eventually be part of the metrics that you're measuring, which is number of people accessing our health services, for example. No, you'll find that the number is still high, but the number does not reflect anything about the qualitative nature of that access, right? Like, are people actually benefiting from these services? That the health services actually cause the impact that we wanted it to cause? Is it actually, changing the health situation of this community in general in this 1 year frame or 5 year frame, right? People will come to the service because out of need and out of fear. If they say no to the service, that the service would stop. As simple as that, right? But again, this does not reflect how people actually feel. And so lack of trust isn't necessarily that people will stop accessing our services if we deploy them. It is more like people will not want to engage with us, will not want to waste time talking to any of us and actually giving their true insights. If we keep dealing with people as data sources and not as people who have opinions, if we don't respect that, and if we don't, provide the right fora for this to actually be the core of the entire work and have us actually be resilient and flexible enough to keep responding to the changing needs, then it's more like, the silent quitting kind of situation where people will be like, you know what, I'll just take whatever I can get, even if it's not the most useful. But, I will never sort of be honestly engaged with you as an organization. I will not waste my time or my energy coming to your focus group discussions that are very tokenistic, that lead to nowhere. And so, yeah, I mean, eventually, I would say it will be more like they will gravitate towards other organizations that are giving them the space. And with time, you will feel like you're struggling to do any outreach for any intervention that you're doing.
Yeah. That's why I do think you're saying the more holistic pillars, having multiple pillars of how you go about this is important because, I'm also like familiar and heard this in multiple discussions. The issue with treating beneficiaries also as data sources, there's some real burnout there because organizations
Exactly.
tend to go to the same sources. And then maybe the data is not very reliable at that point, depending on how tired or unmotivated or irritated or, what.
Some other organization must have actually already asked them the questions you're asking them. Like, also the lack of coordination on accountability on our part, on our level as an organization, puts these communities at a spot where they are fatigued. They are fatigued from having to come and talk to you to get the service they need. They some of them don't have that luxury of space and mental and emotional space, or even, time, because they require the time to work with whatever opportunity they have to actually get the money for sustenance. And even if you add these incentives, like giving them transportation allowance, giving them a break, or like food and drink, or offering them all these things, then it becomes that this becomes the service, the assistance. They are coming now just to get that sort of assistance or money, which they do badly need. And it's honestly a lack of sensitization and planning on our front or lack of understanding on our front, right? But we're just too busy with trying to get them to join our very important focus group discussions, you know?
Yeah, and then the ethics and the power dynamics get
Exactly.
mixed up, and that's kinda undoing the whole point of the AAP framework.
100%, 110%.
Well, fatigue, that's the word I was thinking of as well. So the fatigue is one, like, potential barrier to making AAP meaningful. What are other, potential barriers to having it fully execute?
Well, I mean, the barriers are so many, right? And they don't come in a standardized package. It depends on so many things. Again, doesn't apply to all organizations just the same, but some of them is actually maybe physical access barrier, right? Like what if we as an organization cannot directly geographically access a certain affected community for whatever reason?
So true. Yeah.
What if we also don't have the necessary cultural and linguistic understanding, therefore getting people from the community who can help facilitate this access and can help interpret whatever it is that we're here to do and wanting to do with the communities? I mentioned already the incentives part that makes it sort of also, it sort of transitions it out of the AAP framework into something else completely. Yeah, it becomes a very sort of transactional relationship in a way that doesn't actually serve the affected community. We keep referring to affected communities or affected populations as communities and populations, but they are not homogeneous. There are so many underlying structures and underlying segments that need to be addressed and also have the same rights to all the different AAP pillars. And so understanding that and also being equipped to handle that. Maybe one of the barriers is we're good with talking with adults, with talking with community leaders, but we're not good with reaching out to the children in the community who are the primary stakeholder for our child-friendly spaces, for example. So that's also another barrier. There's the barrier that we have that is more like, other than fatigue, a lot of community members will feel like if I come talk to the organization and I say what I have honestly, then maybe we run the risk of the aid stopping altogether.
Yeah.
And so I'll tell these people what they want to hear in focus group discussions and the feedback channels and whatever. If you ask me, I'll tell you the aid was absolutely amazing and changed my life completely. Whereas that is not the reality of the situation.
How do you mitigate that kind of, like, performative feedback or that performative participation? So, like, both ways, like you said, maybe they're giving you a specific answer because they're afraid the aid is going to stop, or maybe they're giving you a specific answer in order to continue the aid, kind of, like, inflate, I guess, the ego of the organization. So what do you do to check that?
First of all, you need to make sure that whoever is going to talk to these people actually understands their context, understands their their lived experience, understand the situation. And so when we think about, who would be best suited to actually do that in our organization, it would probably be someone who is close to the community. Like maybe one of the things that we can do is we can partner with a specific community based or refugee led organization that can help us with that kind of exercise without us necessarily leading the entire exercise. And this allows us, first of all, the cultural sensitization that is required to carry out an honest conversation. People will naturally feel more comfortable to give an honest opinion on whatever aid that is being provided to someone who is from the community, to someone who understands without them having again to explain their souls. And so it would be to recruit people from the communities, even as volunteers or even as consultants, or it would be to partner directly with community based and refugee led organizations to actually help us do that work and help us do it right. Help us do it without it being tokenistic. Test with them the questions that we're planning to ask. Maybe they will help us reformulate how we ask our questions and our general approach to this conversation. Maybe they will point us to directions that we keep missing or help us identify blind spots, for example. So this is what I'm thinking about. This is the very oversimplified way of mitigating something like that.
For sure, it's, like, always more complicated in practice. But I did want to bring you onto this season towards the end because this whole season we've been talking about lived experience as expertise, And I really do think of accountability to affected populations as one mechanism for operationalizing lived experience. And the guest on the previous episode mentioned something that reminds me of what you said about bringing someone from the community who has that same lived experience as the other beneficiaries to kind of facilitate that feedback mechanism or that focus group or whatnot. She said that lived experience, it builds trust, but it also keeps her accountable because she's from that community as well. So there is accountability that's going both ways. They're accountable to her, and she's definitely accountable and responsible to them because there are consequences if she doesn't come through compared
Exactly.
to maybe those who come from organizations, maybe they're not even from that country, they're likely definitely not from that beneficiary group, and there's less accountability because people come in, come out, they switch positions all the time. That's kind of the nature of the field. It's very, like, transitional. So I thought
Exactly.
that was really, like that was a nice way to kinda summarize it, is that lived experience keeps people accountable. So I do think that's one way to mitigate it, possibly. Well, we just talked about a lot of barriers, which is a bit of a downer, but it's good to keep it critical. I do wanna transition a bit into kind of hearing about your hopes and dreams based on all of this, like, wealth of knowledge you have. So if you could change one thing about how the humanitarian systems operate, what would it be? So tell me, what's your dream scenario?
Uh, this is a question that I know from the get-go I will struggle answering, and perhaps I will run the risk of going around in circles trying to answer this question because I do have so many hopes and so many aspirations for the humanitarian system as a whole. And the more I learn and the more I work in accountability, the more I feel like, my dreams are getting bigger. But I would say one of the things that I want to see going forward is the true mainstreaming of accountability as something that is part and parcel of the way we do the work and not having to internally advocate for it because it just makes sense, period. It just makes sense. It should come naturally to us. When you look at the pillars of AAP, you're not going to be like, oh my God, I didn't know that this could be one of the pillars. You will be like, well, that's very obvious, that's like, it's not rocket science. And if we are able to put ourselves for even 1 minute in the shoes of the affected communities that we are working for and working with, hopefully, we'll understand that these are the minimum rights that should be expected. And if you look at the pillars, they are actually aligned with, like human rights in general. And so this is one thing. I strive to see donors that are looking to join us in field visits and discussions with affected communities. I was dreaming of getting to a point where we get some representation from the donor community to actually come with us to the field in one of our planning sessions or co-designing sessions with a sample of the affected communities and witness for themselves the conversation happening in real time because I think one of the biggest barriers to AAP is donors being so far removed from the actual field and the actual interaction with affected communities. They are helping with their money, right? We want to bridge that gap. It's part of our responsibility as intermediary organizations. Embedding them in the actual discussions will definitely help the case for AAP, will definitely have it be something that is non negotiable, that is absolutely budgeted for and included in the donor's requirements, for example. So this is another dream that I have. I dream of a time when organizations can take, especially very big organizations, can take a little bit of a backseat and give the front seat to the affected communities and be sort of the advisory or counselor bodies in general. We can provide all the technical support that we have. We can provide resources that they need, but the communities themselves can be capacitated in a way that makes them resilient, that makes them have ownership over the entire assistance. But we're no longer the ones thinking for the community. We're no longer the ones designing on behalf of the communities. We're no longer the ones coming in with grievances that worked in Lebanon and trying to transition them to Egypt just as is without factoring in all the differences that we have in terms of context, in terms of cultures, in terms of,
Well, it's because in the West, they think all Arabs are the same. That's why.
I mean, let me not go there. We don't have enough time in our podcast. It's very, very true. And this is why that's one of my points without even stating that very clearly. It is one of the points in which I think it's very important to get the donor community to the field level. You know, you see them in visits, you see them when they come and they're doing their monitoring visits and you are like over preparing everything to welcome them to the field. Everything is literally prepared to be showcased at its best image. And I have a huge problem with that because it feeds into that narrative, like it's sort of like patting yourself on the back in a way. But this is not the reality. You want them to witness a real conversation. In one of my previous experiences, we were distributing hygiene kits to the Sudanese communities during the time when there was the influx after the war. And while we were doing this distribution, we were realizing that a lot of people did not really benefit from all the pre-packed items that were in the hygiene kits. And it makes sense, even if they benefited from them in the first round of distribution, their needs change over time. And the more they stay, the more their needs change. And the more they become integrated into the urbanized areas, which do have pharmacies and have supermarkets, and they have access to that, it becomes a little bit meaningless to distribute hygiene kits in the same format. And one of the things that we wanted to do was to embed a feedback mechanism into the hygiene kits to make sure that affected communities have a way of telling us if the items are actually beneficial or not. And it gives us space to change quickly the content on quarterly basis. We decided that we wanted a few focus group discussions with people who actually gave us feedback. So we went to the field. We had like a series of focus group discussions. And throughout the focus group discussions, we were trying to probe if they had solutions that would help us, distribute hygiene kits in a better way that is relevant to them. And one of the focus group discussions was with adolescent boys who are like 14, 15 years old. They were telling us like a wonderful solution, and that was like applying a modular kits approach, basically laying down all the items in a space and giving each person like a few tokens, and they are allowed to use the tokens to get whatever items. One of them was telling us that he has siblings and they all need toothbrushes, and so instead of getting items they did not need, they would like just simply take 3 toothbrushes, for example. And this came absolutely from them. And I spent the rest of my time in the organization trying to advocate for this to happen. But this requires a drastic shift in the way we provide our assistance, requires resources, figuring out what is an appropriate space, what safeguarding measures are going to be at that space to make sure no one is being harmed as part of the process. Like just figuring out the logistics of it, you could already see how there will be a struggle and there will be a pushback. But just to say that communities, they do have solutions. And it is only with talking with them that we have access to these solutions and we can actually make them happen.
I like that these 14-year-old boys were just like, let us pick out our own stuff. They're like, it's not that complicated, guys. We shop all the time. Just give us our tokens and let us get
It's
what
it's
we want.
simple as that, and it's so humbling. You know what I mean? And this is a model that is already being implemented elsewhere in the world. But it's like if you read about it, you always read about it in a camp setting. Where they give them the supermarket experience because they don't have access to real supermarkets, and that's a way of preserving dignity and autonomy. Whereas in our context, it is different because we don't have a camp situation for refugees, and people are absolutely embedded in the heart of cities and areas that are very densely populated, and there are many service providers like pharmacies and supermarkets. And so usually what they will always ask for is just give us money, right? Give us money and we will use it to our benefit, what we need, right? But the other downfall is cash assistance is not part of the process. What other solutions would you have for us if we cannot provide cash assistance right now? This is also transparency in action, setting the expectations and making sure that as of now, we have limitations to what we can do. What if money is not something that we can offer right now? What if we still have to offer something that is in kind, like items? How would you want to receive them? that is still accountability in action, right?
Okay. Well, thanks for this training on AAP. I'm like taking notes over here. I forgot this was a podcast for a second. But it's so interesting. Like you said, it's, like, rare to speak to someone who kinda just, like, gets it and you can actually, like, really get into the weeds a little bit. I wanna know, just because 'cause you're, like if people can't tell from this talk already, you're, like, a very optimistic person, so I think you're great for AAP because you are trying to, like, force a bit of a culture shift in an organization, which I feel like a lot of people could hate on you for that because people just naturally, like, resist change, but if you ask them to do something, maybe they're more likely to do it. Do you have any advice for practitioners out there who are interested in strengthening or maybe even starting AAP frameworks in their organization?
Of course. I mean, if I can save any person a few years of their lives by giving them, everything that I've learned about AAP and how hard slash easy it is in different regards to implement AAP on the ground, I would say start small. A very key thing that I've learned in order to get the buy-in of my peers of different units in an organization, and the bigger it is, the harder it is. Start small. Find one person who is ready to pilot one thing that you want to do on AAP. Do it and then showcase the results. And then start again. Find another person or another unit who has a project they're working on. Do that work with them. And then once again, showcase the work. Start small because it can be super overwhelming. And AAP is something that is cross sectoral at the end of the day, and if you are one person working on this in your organization, you can easily drown. And so start small, get one thing done, and then move from there. Do not busy yourself too much with working on papers or policies or strategies. What will feed the strategies is the practical work you're trying to do because it will show you, what works and what doesn't. Keep advocating because most of the time it is the fact that people don't understand how to make AAP practical. And if you keep talking about AAP in the conceptual framework that it is, sometimes people will not be able to listen and will not be able to, entertain. You have to make it practical. You have to make sure that when you're advocating for it, you're actually giving them something they can use. They can visualize it being implemented right now. And it will probably take a lot of time because this is cultural change in action. And cultural, if I know anything about social and behavior change, it takes years to see the result that you want to see. And so I would say busy yourself more with how do you bridge the gap between policy and implementation. Busy yourself with how do I take at least one pillar of AAP right now and fit it in this precise project because I can see a clear entry point for it.
Yeah, that's great advice. Do you have any advice for those who feel like their reality or maybe their lived experience is overlooked in humanitarian spaces?
I will here, I think, share something personal first, and from there, I think we're gonna phase into the advice. But so I am someone who has been living in an alternative care situation since I was 7, and I didn't even know what this was called alternative care situation. I lost both my parents when I was young, and I ended up living with my aunt on my mother's side. She's the one who raised me, and she's the one who I would say is still raising me. And I didn't know that what I have been through and what I have experienced in my life as a child is something that, I would later see in some of the children that I was working with as a child protection caseworker. And I do remember many cases that sort of hit a chord with me because there were many angles or many experiences that I had that I could see reflected in them and what they're going through right now. And I think, to be honest, this is why it was so easy for me to transition into this field from the get go because I remember the first thing that I wanted to specialize in was child protection. And the more I learned about child protection and the more I learned about alternative care systems, the more I understood why I gravitated towards it. And the personal relevance it had for me, and the fact that I do understand a lot about, growing up in that situation and the legal aspect to growing up in that situation. And it's basically something that I face every time I go and do some governmental paperwork, you know, something that just hits you in the face every time because, sometimes you can see how systems do not necessarily respond to these situations in a way that preserves the dignity of a person. And, going to become someone who is now, I would say, well versed in child protection, especially for refugee and migrant populations. It is, I feel like I did not give enough credit to how much my lived experience prepared me for that kind of role. I mean, let alone the kind of understanding of the child protection system and infrastructure that we have in the country, just the personal ability to empathize and the ability to speak to a child that is in this kind of vulnerable situation they're in, I think is purely the effect of me having that lived experience. It is absolutely tied to that. And I could see that, the more I grow into the field, the more I realize more and more that I was sort of in a way being prepared for working in something like this. And so this is one aspect of the lived experience that I have that I constantly did not understand the weight of until very recently. And I remember being in a meeting in one of the organizations that I worked in, also specializing in child welfare and child protection in general. And I remember thinking in my head that I have something that I wanted to say that will definitely add to this meeting that is based on experiences that I have witnessed. And, I had all these doubts, like I was thinking this room is filled with experts. Do not say anything. There are even international experts sitting at the table. So just like let it go. You don't have to say it. You don't have to say it. And then I was like, why, why shouldn't I? Why shouldn't I? I mean, even if it's something redundant, why not? Like, and I raised my hand and I came in with my interjection, and it was more about, we were discussing elements related to gender equality in child protection response, and we were thinking about specifically the cash assistance that is being given to refugee boys and girls. And I was telling them in a budgeting session to make sure they understand the money that we give, even though it is the same amount of money that is being given to both girls, adolescent girls experience something that requires them to spend more money than boys just to exist. And that is basically, we were thinking about sanitary pads, for example. And therefore, cash assistance is by default not equitable. That eventually makes them at a disadvantage when you give them the same amount of. And I remember how well received this interjection was. And I was like surprised, like it caught me by surprise. I was thinking they must already know I cannot add anything to this conversation right now. But I felt like if I miss this chance, there might not be another chance to bring this to a table with high profile decision makers. And it actually ended up being added value to this conversation. And so I guess my advice would be never undermine yourself by yourself, for absolutely no reason. Never hesitate to make that interjection that will probably, at best a dent in the whole decision making conversation, or be something that was already discussed or redundant or everybody is aware of. And so it's just another reiteration. You have absolutely nothing to lose. And you just stopped yourself just because you didn't have that faith in your lived experience or the experience that you garnered just by working in this field. Yeah, I think this is my advice.
Yeah, that's great advice. And yeah, thank you for sharing your personal story. That's really like generous of you. You didn't have to do that. I'm kind of surprised to hear that you just recently realized the connection between your lived experience and your career. Because I can see just, from the short time that I've known you, a direct line of how your lived experience led I mean, I guess the dentistry was a bit of like a tangent. That was like a weird path, but then you kind of blew that up and got firmly back into your roots, into a career not only of any kind of advocacy within the humanitarian sector and child protection. So Do you believe that your lived experience has strengthened your practice in AAP and protection?
I think it gave me that sort of missing perspective from all the bureaucracy and policy language and very high profile, uptight meetings and proposals and concept notes. I think it gave me that perspective where, you know, I could actually put myself in a beneficiary's shoes. I might not have benefited from any interventions or any dedicated, child protection services, but I have been there. And I think one of the things that I lacked was being listened to, being informed about what is going to happen to me now. That my living situation is drastically changing, and now I'm moving in with my aunt, who I absolutely love and adore. But at the same time, no one walked me through anything. No one explained to me why what is happening was happening. You know what I mean? And and I just think it sort of gave me that empathetic lens through which I operate in all of my work right now, be it in child protection or AAP. I have that sort of empathy that makes me ready to, internalize something like AAP, believe in every single word that it's advocating for, and even when I was working in child protection without even knowing what AAP was, this was something that I practiced every day because it's the right of every child that I worked with to be informed, to understand exactly what is going to happen and why is it going to happen, to get their opinion on whatever it is that we think is the right decision right now, and to make sure that they are not being subject to anything that they don't understand. And this was at its heart child protection, but also very heavily AAP. And I can immediately now, while I'm talking to you, see where this comes from in me specifically. Why was it easy for me to absorb this so easily when I first landed on it?
Well, probably because this concept of lived experience is relatively new. And, just in the last year or so, I've been seeing positions out there kind of preferencing lived experience, but really it's not something we've spoken about or even considered expertise. And honestly, at least in my experience, some of parts of my identity I've been more encouraged to kind of hide.
Yeah.
Especially in a professional sense, so but, I don't know, hearing you, answer that question and you talk about this, I'm just, so happy for you of where you ended up, and I don't know, it's a difficult time in the humanitarian sector, in the world in general, and I just wanted to say that, you're the perfect person for this type of work, and it really makes me hopeful, and I know
Thank
that,
you.
people are in very good hands when they cross paths with you.
Thank you so much for saying that. I mean, this means so much to me. You have no idea. I don't even know how to begin to respond to this, but other than saying thank you, and I hope that I don't, disappoint. I hope I don't disappoint you. I hope I don't disappoint your faith in me as a humanitarian, as a person who does this kind of job. I will definitely do the best that I can, but it's an uphill battle that requires more than just, one person like me. It requires a lot of drops in the same pond, to cause that ripple that will eventually make the change. And this is why I would, so easily say the same to you. I love what you're trying to do with this project. And that's why I'm very, very happy and honored that you actually asked me to join.
I'm glad it's something you wanna be a part of. So, I guess from where we started from the first question about imposter syndrome, after this talk, how do you feel now? Do you feel like an expert? How could you not? Is how I after hearing you, give every single detail from every single angle and perspective about AAP and accountability mechanisms, do you feel like you're an expert in this work?
I feel like there is definitely room to grow. I mean, definitely talking to you and, trying to explain AAP throughout this podcast and talking about my lived experience, I feel like I have a lot of experience. I feel like I sometimes disregard or fail to see how much I have grown ever since I started this career shift, how much I have learned, how much I have absorbed, and how much I am doing. And I guess this conversation is one of those moments where you can feel the weight of that. I feel like it is definitely eye opening when you talk about all of this in such a format and discuss things that you have dragged yourself through the mud to do, to understand, to study, to work. It is absolutely fascinating come to this point and feel like, wow, I have built myself in this field. But yeah, I definitely feel like I am specialized. I wouldn't call myself an expert yet. I feel like it's a very big word, but definitely will keep striving to build my expertise in this area.
Well, thank you so much. We're so proud of you. Is there anything that, you're excited that's on the horizon? Any like trainings or extracurricular work that you're working on that you'd like to share? Like what's next for you?
So right now, I'm working on a very important part that I consider also one of the pillars of accountability, which is protection from sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. And my work now is focusing on the internal accountability aspect, but with also the accountability to affected populations as well. So we have a lot of trainings on the horizons for sure, internal and external. We have a lot of very nice awareness sort of campaigns that we're preparing for. So yeah, I can't wait.
And I'm imagining a lot of people are going to want to connect with you after hearing this. So how can people get in touch?
I think the best way is, to be honest, LinkedIn. I think it is it's a platform where I'm constantly present because of my work.
Thank you, Tharwat. I'm smiling so much. This was such a great conversation. I'm so happy that
Thank you.
you agreed to do this today.
Thank you so much, Laila. I'm very honored and pleased to have been part of this. And, like, I'm also smiling so hard. And it just feels great to have had this conversation with you.
Yeah, it's more, vulnerable and emotional than you kinda realize until
It
it's
is.
happened, and then you're like, "Oh, I'm really proud of myself."
I'm really proud of myself that I went through it without crying.
One thing that really stands out from this conversation is that listening isn't the hard part. Most systems already know how to collect feedback. They know how to run surveys, set up hotlines, hold consultations. The harder question is what happens next? Does that feedback actually change anything? Does it shift decisions, priorities, or power? Or does it stay where it started? I think what this conversation with Tharwat highlights is that accountability isn't about having the right tools. It's about whether systems are actually willing to respond. Thank you so much, Tharwat, and thanks for listening to The Imposters. And that's it for today's episode. If you'd like to learn more about today's conversation, visit theimposters.org, where you can explore episode resources and browse the wider archive of lived experience experts. Tune in to The Imposters wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'm Lila Raouf. Thanks so much for listening.